You're really pushing it there. Scott Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too want to join with others, well, Phil Twyford, in congratulating the member Alfred Naro, who has been shepherding this bill through the House to now what is the concluding debate in its third reading. And as the chairman of the Local Government Environment Select Committee that considered this bill, it was a great privilege, sir, to get to know the bill well, to understand its genesis, to get a feel for what it's all about. Because those of us that don't live in Auckland are not really familiar with the creatures that are known as local boards. Local boards were created at the time that the Auckland City was established by statute, and they are a kind of hybrid that is something more than a community board, but something less than a membership on the governing body of the council. And so they have evolved and established themselves as an important and integral part of the Auckland City governance model. And this bill, as the member Alfred Naro indicated, was originally put into the ballot by our mutual friend and colleague, the Honourable Maggie Barry, who, upon her elevation to the executive, passed the bill over to Alfred Naro, who has done, I think, a very good job in working it through the Select Committee process. He sat on the Select Committee hearings, he heard from submitters, and he has been very involved in the process since he took over responsibility for it. And I think he's done a very good job and should be congratulated on it, because, as Mr. Twyford said, it's not every member of this House that has the good fortune to firstly have a bill drawn from the ballot, but then to have it successfully work its way through the legislative process that is the parliamentary legislative system to a point of being read a third time with a high prospect of success. So that is no small feat, and I know that the senior government whip is looking forward to, with aspirational ambition, to achieving that same kind of goal in the not too distant future, before he too, I'm sure, is finds himself in a high place in this Parliament. Well, that's very good, Mr. McIndoe. I'm greatly concerned now. However, that said, this bill really is largely of a technical nature, but it's an important one because it goes to what is a fundamental foundation stone in terms of creating and maintaining the credibility of democracy in our local government system. And I think that members and the general public would, I'm sure, agree with Mr. Naro in his proposition that as a rule, it's not possible for one person to effectively and responsibly, and without the potential prospect of conflict arising, for one person to represent more than one constituency at a time. And, sir, I want to just raise the prospect, for instance, of the possibility of a citizen standing for election in two parliamentary constituencies, and then perhaps having the good luck or good fortune to be elected to two parliamentary constituencies, and then trying to represent themselves in the Parliament, or indeed in a fair and equitable, unbiased way, representing both those constituencies. And so that's exactly the situation that has occurred. And if I'm correct in hearing Mr. Twyford correctly, I think he said that there, or maybe it was Alfred Naro, that there are currently 5 people who are on more than 2 local boards in Auckland. And, sir, I think that's problematic for the voters of Auckland, the people who make those voting decisions to put people into elected representative positions, and they expect them to be able to, without fear or favour, represent the geographic region to which they have been elected. And I just can't see how it is that someone can really effectively represent 2 geographic areas simultaneously at the one time and do justice to both those roles, or in some cases potentially on more than two cases. So Mr. Naro made mention of a technical change that was made by way of supplementary order paper 418 as the bill progressed through the House. and that supplementary order paper 418, and that introduces into this bill, sir, clause 6, and clause 6 means that current and or existing members of local boards won't be affected by the provisions of this bill, and the provisions of this bill will, if passed tonight, kick in and become effective at the elections later, to be held later this year. So what is it that this bill seeks to do? Well, the bill seeks to remedy a loophole in the current legislation which does allow people to stand for multiple local boards, and then, if they are successful, to go on and represent more than one board. And that, I, sir, think is not a position that this House or indeed the voting public in Auckland are particularly supportive of. Now, that is really in no way a commentary on the ability or the integrity of the people that have found themselves elected to more than one board, because I think that it goes without saying that they are people of good intent, high integrity, and that they are people who, in their minds, feel that they are doing justice to the multiple roles that they are representing. But, sir, for me, the risk really about this is the risk of perception. And those of us that are involved actively in politics and in representing the public in our elected roles, we know all too well that in politics perception is reality. And even though a board member who represents more than one board may feel in their heart and in their mind and can justify it to themselves on a rational basis that they're doing a good and effective job, it's the perception of conflict, it's the perception of not being able to do justice to both boards, it's the perception of in some way having to discount one against another that creates the problem. And so that's why I think this bill should go through. Alfred Naro, in his third reading speech given just a few minutes ago, made the point that we are fortunate to live in a participatory democracy. It's one of the great hallmarks of being a New Zealand citizen and a voter in our parliamentary and our local government system, that we actually have a very high level of participation. And that's a participatory democracy that involves citizens, fine upstanding citizens, nominating and putting themselves forward for election, and at the very basis of our participatory democracy relies on good folk nominating and putting themselves forward. And equally, so it is that the participatory democracy that we so enjoy relies on people going out and voting. And in local government elections, they do it by mail, by postal ballot, and that means that if they are to have credible faith in the local government system, then they need to be confident that the people they are electing will be fine, upstanding citizens who can do justice to the job that they are elected to. And so it's this participation and the prospect of conflicts of interest that goes to the very core and integrity of our local government democratic process and system. Sir, I want to just mention the submissions, because there were some 17 written submissions in total. The majority of those submissions, 10 of them in fact, were in complete support of the bill, and we received those submissions from people who had given the bill very careful consideration, and I was grateful as committee chair to receive them and to give them consideration, because I thought that the submissions had all been well thought through, they were well presented, and they presented cogent and logical arguments in favour of the bill. There were, however, sir, 3 submissions that were opposed to the bill. And ironically, and I guess maybe not surprisingly, those 3 submissions that were opposed to the bill all came from people who currently sit on 2 or more boards. And so that in itself, I guess, in a way, goes to backing up my assertion that in fact it's the perception of a conflict, it's the perception of self-interest that is actually the issue here. Whether or not in fact they are physically and intellectually capable of doing the two jobs simultaneously almost is irrelevant. It is the perception that's important, and Sir, I found as we went through this bill that the more the committee considered it, the more we got to a point where we found that the arguments put forward by Mr Naro in this bill were very cogent, they were rational, and they were worthy of the support of this House. Sir, I commend this bill to the House.
Ko Meka Waitiri.
Tēnā